And now, it's the Finding Your Spine podcast with host Chase Spears.
Welcome back to the Finding Your Spine podcast, where we call you to live and lead boldly in the truth. And Tom Rempfer is a man who knows exactly how to do that. Tom and I have got connected the last couple of years because of my advocacy and trying to fight for military members who are really completely disenfranchised for their stance over the COVID vaccine. And Tom lived that in a generation prior to me with the Anthrax vaccine, which is something that I've got a lot of questions for Tom about because that actually touched the very beginning of my military career. But this is going to be a really neat investigation of military policy over the decades and hearing from another man who's been standing up for a lot longer than I have on this topic. So Tom, man, it's just great to have you here. I'm so glad you're willing to come on. Thanks for carving in the time.
Absolutely, Chase. I appreciate you having me.
You bet. Just so everyone knows, Tom served an Air Force career, retiring as a colonel, an aviator by trade, but a warrior for constitutionalism from the start. Whereas my generation of veterans fought against illegal COVID mandates, his generation of vets fought against the tyrannical anthrax mandates. And he led that fight for a very long time and continues to lead it today. Even though he was an aviator in the military, he's still an aviator today, flying just about every variety of wide-body jet around the world, something I'm really kind of jealous about, and I'm going to try to ask you about at some point along the way. In 2024, Tom released a memoir about his journey titled Unyielding, Marathon Against Illegal Mandates. And Tom, from what I've known of you these last couple of years, that's still your life. That's still your passion, your mission. You're still running that marathon against these illegal mandates. And I'm so impressed because we're 2026. This started for me in 2020. 6 years in, it can get tiring. And you've been running this a lot longer than I have. What keeps you going on it?
Yeah, Chase, it started in 1997. So it's almost 30 years. And the mission's not complete. They haven't fixed the damage that they created. And so I remain committed, frankly, for the rest of my life to ensuring that the Department of Defense holds itself accountable and actually corrects the records for the Anthrax era veterans that were punished over that patently illegal mandate as affirmed by the federal courts. And so that's my mission. It has been literally almost 3 decades that I've been involved in it. I can go into a little bit of the background for you on how I got into this. And then I also think, since we are talking about large spans of time, I want to talk about some historical anecdotes as well that even go back further in the past in order to help us understand how egregious the unlawful conduct was by the Department of Defense and the government with both the anthrax vaccine mandate and the COVID shot mandate.
So this started in 1997 for you, and I'm thinking back the very beginning of my military career. I came in at the end of 2003, and so this is when Iraq and Afghanistan are both going full tilt. I know I'm going to deploy, and when I'm going through the soldier readiness processing, I don't know what they call that for the Air Force, but in the Army they call it soldier readiness processing, SRP, and it's the round robin kind of day at this complex, and they're giving you a bunch of shots and doing all these tests to validate that you are deployable. And one of those things that I went through was to get the alleged anthrax vaccine. And at that point in time, I'm a young 20-something-year-old. I'm a brand new soldier. I totally trust the institution. They're telling me I need this in order to deploy. All I know about anthrax is that I've heard it used as one of these big scare words post 9/11, that anthrax letters were mailed around and we're going to be under an anthrax attack. And so, of course, I'm like, hey, anything that helps protect me from that sounds good. And I'll never forget, that was the first ever thing put in my body, Tom, that knocked me on my back. And I remember being so sick after that and literally telling Lori, back then it was you had to have a second series of it, kind of like the so-called COVID vaccine. And I remember telling my wife and thinking, I don't want to get a second of this because this thing is like hurting me. And I don't know if it was the court injunction that saved me or what it was, but I didn't have to go back for the second one. And so I'm just laying out the context. That was my introduction. This started for you way before. So lay out, what is the story of this thing?
Yeah, so in 2003, when you encountered this dilemma, the Department of Defense in the early part of the year was still mandating anthrax. But late in the year, in December of that year, the federal courts intervened, and they essentially said anthrax vaccine is an unapproved medical product. It is investigational for what the Department of Defense is using it for. And even worse, they never actually finalized, the FDA never finalized the license for the anthrax vaccine. It was still lingering since 1985 as a proposed rule in the Federal Register. And as you know, any kind of rulemaking has to go through the full process. You have to have a final rule. We had discovered that several years earlier. Our experience began in 1997 when they mandated the vaccine, 1998 when we were a part of a commander's team in order to bring any concerns that service members might have had about the anthrax vaccine mandate to the attention of the chain of command. And so the things we brought over the years to their attention were the fact that in 1985, the U.S. government acknowledged they needed a new anthrax vaccine, but they never procured one. It had safety and efficacy problems. Similarly, that year, I touched upon it before, they filed a proposed rule in the Federal Register in order to get the anthrax vaccine licensed. They never finalized it. That ended up becoming the foundational aspect of the federal court ruling in 2003 that shut the program down because they had never properly licensed the vaccine. And they were using it for something that was investigational. That was an issue that we brought to the attention of the chain of command in 1998. It's investigational, and therefore it's in direct violation of the express wording of 10 U.S.C. 1107. Title 10, Section 1107 of the U.S. Code, Title 10, written for service members. This is a law that was put into place after the first Gulf War because of the despicable record of medical experimentation on the troops during that time frame. They put a law in place to stop the experimentation on the troops. And so they were in direct violation as a result of the anthrax vaccine being investigational. And they unfortunately did it anyway. They'd even filed investigational new drug license applications with the Food and Drug Administration to try to get it properly approved. They were not approved. They'd been issued a notice of intent to revoke the license of the manufacturer by the Food and Drug Administration based on significant deviations from current good manufacturing practices. So the record was littered with all kinds of problems with respect to the vaccine regulatory record, legal record, and the federal courts finally said enough. And fortunately, they halted the program just prior to the end of 2003. Unfortunately, a little too late for you as far as the first round of the series. And you mentioned that there was a second round. There were actually 6 at the time. They wanted you to take 6 shots. They later reduced that to 5. So that's a little bit of the background there. And one historical anecdote that I want to bring into the mix is the fact that several years before our tasking by the chain of command to investigate the anthrax vaccine, there was a Senate report published, Senate Report 10397. The later Army Surgeon General Ron Blank had testified to the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, and he had admitted that the vaccine was investigational. He had admitted that the undiagnosed illnesses from the first Gulf War could not be excluded as being caused by anthrax vaccine. Anthrax vaccine was the largest exposure during the first Gulf War to toxic substances. And the Department of Defense knows perfectly well that is the most likely cause of Gulf War illness. And so they made sure that they didn't study it, and they made sure that they introduced all kinds of other red herrings, some possibly legitimate exposures, but anthrax vaccine is the most likely cause of Gulf War illness. And that's why they haven't studied it as a possible cause.
Can you spell out to me, what does investigational mean? That's the first time I've heard the use of that term when it comes to some sort of therapeutic regimen.
So in FDA parlance, I think instead of using the word experimental, they tend to use the word investigational. And that means it hasn't been proven to be safe or effective, either or. And so what they do is they put in what's called an IND, an investigational new drug application, and they try to get drugs and vaccines approved properly. The IND application is the first part. They put multiple IND applications in to get the anthrax vaccine properly approved. And as of the time when the federal court enjoined the program, shut it down with an injunction, they hadn't gotten those applications approved. So contrary to the rhetoric that the Department of Defense espoused in its sound bites, that it's safe, effective, and FDA approved, none of that was true. The Federal Register entries, the requests for proposals for new vaccines, all questioned the safety and the efficacy of the product, and the fact that there was not a final rule in the Federal Register, final license for an anthrax vaccine, means it also was not FDA approved. So anyway, investigational, basically still under study. They just don't know. It's actually very interesting because it's kind of similar to the emergency use authorized products, which you encountered during the COVID era. Emergency use authorized COVID shots were introduced. They were unapproved medical product. That says it right there on the FDA website. It's an unapproved medical product. Or was during the time frame of all the mandates and all of the punishments and all the less than fully honorable discharges. So just as a vaccine can be investigational, it can also be maybe a little bit more proven, reasonably considered safe and effective, but not proven safe and effective. And that is the essence of what an emergency use authorization is. They just don't know, but they believe it to be reasonably safe and effective. And that's the next historical anecdote I want to kind of introduce to you, is this idea that for literally the past over 100 years, our government has tried to be more stringent, scrutinize the safety and efficacy of drug products more and more responsibly. 1906, you had the original Food and Drug Act. 1938, they introduced safety requirements to the Federal Food and Cosmetic Act. And in 1962, they actually introduced efficacy requirements. So over the years, they tried to be more and more stringent, make sure drug products were safe and effective, proven safe and effective. And it wasn't until the anthrax vaccine program was declared illegal and that they invented the emergency use authorization law to now allow and authorize reasonably safe and effective products. They lessened the standard for the first time in American history and the preceding 100 years of drug law. They lessened the requirements. They did it as a result of the anthrax vaccine being declared illegal because they wanted to go ahead and continue to look like it was okay to give the troops the anthrax vaccine. Anthrax vaccine was the first ever EUA, emergency use authorized product. And they did it in order to allow it to be still given to the troops, despite the federal court injunction, which had, for all practical purposes, shut the program down. But in doing so, they made sure that they said in the Federal Register that it had to be voluntary. EUA products had to include the option to accept or refuse. There could be no penalty, no loss of benefit or entitlements. Soldiers couldn't even be barred from deployment for declining an emergency use authorized product. And so that historical anecdote, the drug history, the decreasing of the regulatory requirements was very important, happened right after anthrax vaccine, the first ever EUA. And then, of course, as we know, the COVID shots were all EUA because they really didn't know if they worked. And then, as it turns out, from a historical lens, we all know today that there's serious safety questions about the shots, and we all know that they didn't stop infection or transmission. So for all practical purposes, they didn't work, certainly not as advertised. Same mantra, safe, effective, FDA approved. They frankly lied about that, and the lie was repeated across the country, across the world, as though they were approved, but they weren't. They were simply authorized under this lesser standard. So hopefully that historic anecdote and how it tied into anthrax vaccine is valuable.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And let me ask you, you mentioned, you alluded earlier to toxic exposure that troops coming out of Gulf War were exposed to. And then they kind of, sounds like they used some of that as an excuse for why we must have this anthrax so-called vaccine going into Gulf War 2.0. Can you, and that's a whole section of military history you lived, I'm just sort of hearing about. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And it really preceded the Second Gulf War. The advent of the anthrax vaccine policy, it sprang up in the 1997 timeframe when the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense were being questioned about how are you going to protect the troops, because the UN weapons inspectors had just been essentially booted out of Iraq. And so the immediate response was, we have an anthrax vaccine. We will use this anthrax vaccine to protect the troops. And for all practical purposes, all questions about force protection went away. And I discussed this in the book because it's a very important beginning of this political response to very important force protection issues. So troops for decades have known that biological weapons were a potential risk. Our commanders knew that they were a risk. Our highest military officials knew that they were a risk. At our service academies and in our professional military education, we were all trained that for all practical purposes, we don't go there. We don't vaccinate against biological threats because they are so unpredictable. And if we start this escalatory tit-for-tat process of saying we can defend against this, we're effectively just encouraging potential adversaries of the United States of America to develop more dangerous pathogens. And so I want to bring in kind of my third historical anecdote, and I want to talk a little bit about in 1969 how President Nixon had actually promulgated National Security Decision Memo 35. And that decision memorandum from the President of the United States was a result of the U.S. government recognizing that the entire arena of biological defense and biological offense was very dangerous. It was very unpredictable. And the reason why he put out this decision memorandum at the national security level was to stop the development of biological offensive weapons in particular. But creating a carve-out, essentially a caveat where they could still do defensive research. And the reason was, specifically stated by President Nixon, was to make sure we don't end up having pandemics and epidemics in the future as a result of our dangerous research. But what happens is both with anthrax and with COVID, with anthrax, you end up having an intentional leak from a lab with anthrax that was supposed to be about defensive research, and it creates an epidemic, and people die. There were 5 deaths from the anthrax letter attacks, and so that happened kind of between halfway in between when I got involved in the anthrax vaccine issue and when you were forced to take anthrax vaccine before we got the court injunction. But in the first few years, we were very successful in working with government officials. I received personally a call from Karl Rove, personally worked with the offices of Senator Daschles, Gephardt, Blumenthal, Warner, Shays, personally worked with elected representatives in order to try to put scrutiny on and hopefully halt the anthrax vaccine program. Karl Rove, on his phone call with me, specifically emphasized that he was having Paul Wolfowitz investigate the program in the Department of Defense, and within a few months we got the result of that investigation, and it was to effectively cancel the anthrax vaccine program. develop a new vaccine, which they knew they needed for years, and develop a doctrinally coherent manner to deal with these threats in the future. Just like President Nixon wanted the U.S. government to do in 1969, because they realized that these programs too easily got out of control. The outcomes were too uncertain. It was too dangerous. It could cause pandemics and epidemics. So this process, this deliberative process between the White House and the Department of Defense went on during the summer of 2001. The recommendations were approximately 1 month prior to 9/11. After 9/11, within a week, somebody put anthrax letters in the mail. Those anthrax letters scared everybody, and instead of canceling the anthrax vaccine program and mandate, they ended up accelerating it. And so my thought at the time was that they were absolutely being played. Somebody, probably an inside job, put these anthrax letters in the mail in order to halt the progress we'd made with Karl Rove, the Bush White House, Don Rumsfeld and his undersecretaries, and all of these elected representatives, some of whom had put out the sole congressional report, and they titled it Unproven Force Protection. So the news was not good for the Department of Defense, and unfortunately, the anthrax letter attacks saved the program. Now, the only problem was that it took them 10 years to actually come up with the FBI and the Department of Justice findings that affirmed that the anthrax letter attacks were an inside job from a scientist at Fort Detrick who was responsible for the anthrax vaccine, and that scientist's motive was to save the failing anthrax vaccine program. And unfortunately, nobody on Capitol Hill, nobody in the federal government went back and said, hey, maybe we should go back and look at the punishments that we had meted out against these troops. Maybe we should go back and look at why the anthrax vaccine program was about to be canceled in 2001. They didn't do any of that. As a matter of fact, the most high-profile individual that was attacked was Senator Daschle. Senator Daschle on Capitol Hill, his office was attacked with anthrax. I was actually on the phone with his office at the very moment that they opened up the anthrax letter. They called it an anthrax package when I was talking to them on the phone, and they evacuated the office. I never heard from Senator Daschle's office again. And unfortunately, nobody went back and did the right thing and corrected the records for our troops, which is exactly what Senator Daschle had done for us in a letter to Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld about 3 months prior to the anthrax letter attacks. And so they shut everybody down. They got the program started again, and it ended up taking our federal court case and a federal court injunction to finally stop the program and get the vaccine licensed properly.
You know, I've actually driven out there to Fort Detrick a few times. That was where the brigade headquarters was for my unit when I was a lieutenant stationed at Fort Meade. And I had heard stories about the labs there on Fort Detrick, and just driving around, there was always something that just seemed very uneasy to me about that base. And I mean, this is reading like a really bad Clancy novel, that we have this program that's known to be bad. It's on the verge of being rightly shut down, and then a scientist, whether he be rogue or whether he be institutionally put up for it, pulls this crime and saves this evil program. It's straight out of a bad movie. You just can't make this stuff up. So let me jump and ask, I know what it was like being in the military COVID era. And, COVID was something that had the entire globe's attention. I mean, it was just this nonstop gaslighting. Every news station was just constantly COVID this, COVID that. And so the public was really taken in with all the talking points, safe and effective. I remember Lori and I, we always kind of watch something in the evening on television, usually something Star Trek, just to kind of wind down before we go to bed. And the COVID, the shot commercials were just everywhere. And I noticed, I told her, I said, I can't help but notice the fact that these shot commercials are just saying safe and effective, and that's it. And then it's cut to black and we're done and back to the show. Whereas every single other pharmaceutical advertisement I've seen my entire life, I mean, it can be something as simple as a pill trying to clear up pimples. they read out a good 30, 45 seconds worth of disclaimers of potential side effects. And I told Lori, it's amazing to me how they cut through red tape and they made this thing in just absolutely rapid fashion, and it has no risks at all. How about that? How about that? And so what was it like for you being on the inside? Because for me as a troop, I had the one shot, and I was young, dumb, didn't know to ask the questions I know to ask now. And I was just, they told me I needed this, I got it. What was it like for you as a leader at that point in time, the years before I joined, who's seeing what's really going on here and bringing this to your leadership attention? You've mentioned people being kicked out. I'm guessing you were received probably about like we were from our chains of command.
Yes. So, unfortunately, we lost our jobs as A-10 forward air controllers at the time. We gave our findings to the chain of command and said, hey, boss, it's illegal. And the chain of command completely ignored us, and they grounded us from our A-10 flight duties. And so they took no adverse personnel action against us. They just said that because you haven't taken the anthrax vaccine, you've lost your mobilization status. We're grounding you because you can't be mobilized. And therefore, they would have removed us to the inactive reserves had we not sidestepped, found other jobs where the anthrax vaccine wasn't required, and where we were able to, frankly, continue this fight and be supported by a chain of command that was supportive of us and effectively protected us. And so, it's important to think about, kind of how they punished people during our era. Many of the same parallels during your era. A great disparity in how troops were treated. Some troops during our era were actually given court-martialed, demoted to the lowest rank, fined, given jail time, and dishonorably discharged, given bad conduct discharges. Whereas other people like myself and my dear colleague, the late Lieutenant Colonel Russ Dingle, who I try to give tribute to in all of my work, because he was really the intellectual founder of all of our arguments. I helped Russ. I was his deputy on our task force. We called it a Tiger Team. Our commander called it a Tiger Team. And we had made sure the chain of command knew perfectly well that this was an illegal order, and we have a duty to disobey illegal orders. Unfortunately, the chain of command dismissed our concerns, didn't answer our concerns. On my website, Unyielding, there's actually video clips of our commander acknowledging that the efficacy and safety was in question, and actually calling us traitors, referring to us, implying that that what we were doing was treasonous if we didn't take the anthrax vaccine. So it was this kind of bad behavior. You saw the same thing during the COVID shot fiasco. Basically, this bad behavior by officers that you had previously respected, and they were behaving in a way you had never seen before in the United States Armed Forces. Our operational practitioner mindset, basically came face to face with this incredibly bad behavior by military officials who could not answer the questions. Interestingly, the Army Surgeon General, the same guy who admitted to the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee that the undiagnosed illnesses couldn't be excluded from anthrax vaccine, wrote an op-ed in the middle of this dilemma to the Military Times, where it was titled, "Ignore the Paranoiacs." So just like with your generation, where everybody was labeled as conspiracy theorists, the same thing happened with us. This general officer, the Army Surgeon General, said, "Ignore the paranoiacs," and it implied that anybody questioning the anthrax vaccine is like people who think that their organs are going to be stolen when they travel internationally. I mean, he actually wrote these things. So the ultimate gaslighting. And Of particular note and interest, these days we talk about, internet misinformation, disinformation. Really, with the anthrax vaccine controversy, it was the first time the Department of Defense had ever implied that their service members were providing, or reading internet misinformation, and were espousing, disinformation. The reality is that it was the Department of Defense and it was the U.S. government that was providing all of the misinformation. And before we started the broadcast, I mentioned to you that my entire position, everything that I have stated publicly across almost 3 decades, it's all based on Department of Defense documents, memos with Department of Defense letterhead, government reports, Senate reports, House reports, congressional reports, Government Accountability Office reports and findings, all questioning the safety and efficacy of the anthrax vaccine, and even questioning the unapproved manufacturing processes that had been implemented, effectively adulterating the anthrax vaccine just prior to the first Gulf War in order to create more of the product. And again, it was my dear colleague, the late Lieutenant Colonel Russ Dingell. He discovered all of those findings, but unfortunately, the FDA, in the aftermath of 9/11 and the anthrax letter attacks, they just blindly approved everything that we had discovered had been illegally altered, literally more than 10 years early, adulterating the product. They just approved everything, and they went ahead and said that they can start manufacturing anthrax vaccine again. And they did that, but they actually didn't have a license. And so it took the federal court a couple of years later to shut the program down because it wasn't properly FDA licensed, even though it was reapproved and accelerated for manufacturing after the anthrax letter attacks. But I think that those anecdotes about misinformation and gaslighting are really important because it's the pattern we saw with both anthrax and COVID. It's a shared experience, and anytime we see our military and our government officials gaslighting people, it's probably time to take a step back and look at why they're exhibiting this bad behavior. In both cases, these were patently illegal, unlawful medical mandates for the military, and with COVID for our civilian population as well. They were unapproved medical products, and the law, in particular for troops, protected our troops from being mandated those products. And so that's why I'm so proud of the Trump administration and Secretary of War Hegseth for acknowledging that publicly and making sure that the American people and our troops and our commanders, unfortunately, there hasn't been enough education, but the Secretary of War himself has acknowledged that these products were unlawfully provided to our troops, and all of the coercion and all of the adverse personnel actions, the less than fully honorable discharges, were all wrong. So I'm similarly proud of the administration for trying to correct that, provide reinstatements, provide back pay, remedy career setbacks. None of it is happening as quickly as I want, and certainly not as quickly as your generation wants. But they have done yeoman's work compared to my anthrax era generation, where literally nothing has been done substantively to correct the records for our troops that were harmed, dishonorably discharged, jailed, demoted over the anthrax vaccine mandate, which was, again, from a historical lens, absolutely illegal, patently illegal during the time frame that they punished all of the troops. And so one of my big pitches, passions, is that the government needs to correct those records for anthrax era veterans, just as they have set the precedent that they are correcting records for COVID era veterans. And most importantly, as recently as December 3rd, the Department of War Secretary Hegseth himself have acknowledged that they are going to do proactive reviews of discharges and automatically upgrade discharges to fully honorable for COVID era veterans. Chase, that's all I've been asking for 30 years. There was such an inequitable treatment between myself and many of my pilot colleagues who are allowed to continue to serve. I served for almost 20 more years and retired as a full colonel versus these young people that were kicked out, dishonorably jailed and fined, and given bad conduct discharges. It's the least that a compassionate government and responsible government officials could do is to apply that same equitable treatment that they're giving to COVID era vets and provide that compassionately to Anthrax era veterans. It's overdue. And it's not just overdue, but they actually undermined the first attempt to do it. In 2018, President Trump and the White House directed the Department of Defense to review and correct records related to the anthrax vaccine mandate. And what happened was the Department of Defense is under the Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness Office for the Personnel and Readiness. They put out a memo. The memo was generic. It didn't even mention anthrax on it. So they've been given direction from the White House to correct anthrax records. They put out a memo. They don't even mention anthrax vaccine. Chase, they don't even publish the memo. They provided the memo to me. I provided it to several Marines in particular that I was trying to help get the records corrected. Each of those people were successful in getting their records fully corrected, but they published a generic memo. They put out a generic memo. They never published it, and they only provided outreach to me, and they only corrected the records of the people that I was able to actually help. On my website, unyielding.org, the memo is there. The process for filing Department of Defense Form 149s has always been available to our troops. If our troops apply for record corrections, they will get their discharges upgraded. The most recent one was just last spring. There was a Marine Corps lieutenant who'd been sentenced to 8 months in jail for refusing the anthrax vaccine over an illegal Department of Defense mandate. This guy was sentenced to 8 months in the brig. He didn't serve all that time, but it took until last spring when the Trump administration came in for this latest and the only third that I know of anthrax record correction to have occurred, and he got a fully honorable discharge. The other Marines, the enlisted gentlemen, they actually got good conduct medals. They got their rank reinstated. They got back pay for the time frame that they were in the appellate review process. Fully honorable discharges. So Department of Defense did do the right things for these folks. They should have done it 20-something years ago. Excuse me. But they did do the right thing. It's zero cost, Chase, compared to the COVID era veterans, which is much more recent in history and which our administration has gratefully offered back pay, reinstatement, career setbacks. Those are much more complex cases. For anthrax era veterans, so much time has passed that the least the government can do is zero cost discharge upgrades for these troops. And, get the printer running. Start updating the personnel system. President Trump already told the Department of Defense to do this in 2018. He was undermined with an unpublished generic memo and zero outreach. I think that if the Trump administration, if President Trump and Secretary Hegseth were aware of the incredible inequity between how COVID era veterans are being treated and anthrax era veterans, I think they would immediately move to make sure that the right thing is done, not to mention to undo the undermining that occurred in 2018. In my fourth, and this hopefully be my final historical anecdote, over the years, whether it was radiation testing or Agent Orange or Gulf War illness, our presidents have stepped up 2 decades later, 30 years later, 4 and even 5 decades later, and they've said, we need to fix this and we need to take care of these veterans. Unfortunately, a lot of time tends to pass. Now it's been 3 decades since the anthrax vaccine dilemma. It's time to finally fix it. President Trump is the right guy to do it. He already tried to do it. He needs to order his Department of Defense officials to fix it once and for all.
Well, this needs to be ordered and followed up on. I mean, I think back to my time when I was at the brigade, right, which is an 06 level command. And it's one thing to publish an order from the G3 or the J3 and say, okay, the order's been published and we've given the command and just assume it's all been done. It's another thing to put on that tracker a follow-up mechanism. Hey, what's been done? Who's doing it? When's the latest action on it? And that's where I think that we've been missing the boat again and again and again and again, where leaders like President Trump in 2018 issue the order, assume it's being carried out, and just are not doing the follow-up. I could go down a long diatribe on that. I'm gonna pull back for time, and let me ask you, how many people, or is there even a reasonable estimate on how many people were kicked out, court-martialed, jailed from the Anthrax era?
It's a great question. So I've scoured media reports over those years and since. I put the numbers at least 1,000 troops were given adverse personnel actions. There's probably thousands and thousands more. But just like with COVID, they only admit to, say, 8,400 or 8,700 troops, but we know there's tens and tens of thousands of other troops that were coerced out, maybe given fully honorable discharges, but the root cause was the COVID shots. And with Anthrax, I think we're talking about overall smaller numbers, but also very significant. Chase, it doesn't matter if it's only one trooper that needs to get their records corrected. They need to do the right thing. But in this case, there's thousands of them. And interestingly, from an accountability mechanism standpoint, as a part of the 2001 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, they actually passed into law 10 U.S.C. 1178. So again, Title 10, Section 1178, laws written for the Department of Defense. The Congress ordered them to track anthrax vaccine refusals and discharges. So that question should be posed to the Department of Defense, to the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. Find out if they ever actually collected that data. If they did, take that list and start running the printer and start printing those honorable discharge certificates. If they did not comply with the law and do what Congress ordered them to do, then they need to compile that list, and they need to start the printer, and they need to start filling out the envelopes and sending out those honorable discharge certificates and updating the personnel system so that those soldiers at a minimum could maybe reach back and execute their earned VA educational benefits. That would be literally the only cost. But guess what? It was earned by our troops. So for all practical purposes, there was no cost. It was already funded by the United States Congress. Congress ordered the Department of Defense, 10 U.S.C. 1178, to track the refusals and discharges. OUSD PNR needs to take that list or compile that list and get compliant with the law and start sending out those honorable discharge certificates proactively, unilaterally, automatically, just like they're doing for COVID. And if they don't do it, hopefully the President or the Secretary of War will order them to do so.
Well, not only does there need to be orders to do so, but Tom, I'm in the camp that there's got to be some form of accountability mechanism, not only for commanders, senior officials who pushed these unlawful mandates, but for those who are continuing to stand in the way. I mean, I look to my right and my left, and I've still had people on the show who are still being prosecuted over shop mandates that the Secretary of War has actually rescinded and said these don't exist anymore. But the chains of command are saying, well, the person violated the thing when it did exist, so we're going to continue with the prosecution. And my contention, Tom, is I think a lot of commanders have completely lost sight of the fact that their subordinates are not merely military subordinates. They are military subordinates. I get that. And they are... You can't, in every situation, think of how does this make the person feel. In combat, you have to be able to order troops to the line. I get that. I understand. But they're also fellow citizens in the Republic. And I think that's the thing that offends me probably the most about this, is that these people pushing these illegal mandates and the people standing in the way of making it right are acting as if the people who are harmed they're not equal to them in the Republic. And I think that's the thing that offends me the most about this.
Once again, I'm encouraged that the Trump administration, their representative, Anthony Tata in Personnel and Readiness, actually, as of literally last week, not only was standing up a task force to address an after-action report. Kind of that element of accountability is very important, absolutely missing to date, never happened after the anthrax vaccine disaster. Had they done an after-action report with anthrax vaccine, we probably never would have had the unlawful COVID shot mandate. And so I was encouraged once again by our Trump administration, Department of War, that they're standing up this task force, and they also used, for the very first time, they used the word accountability. And so hopefully that task force after action report and review process will give some paths forward as far as accountability. But your generation and my generation, we saw what's really going on. And what happened during anthrax and what happened during COVID was an inversion of accountability. The people that were breaking the law actually got promoted. The people that were questioning the unlawful conduct got crushed. And so that is something that this task force, the after action review process, needs to seriously look at. The idea that you had commanders that would pass the biological loyalty oath and they would get promoted, whereas the constitutionally minded soldier that was doing their duty under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 90 and 92 of the Manual for Court Martial, and were challenging patently illegal conduct, they were kicked out and discharged. A total inversion of accountability. And so hopefully the task force does look at that. That would be my hope.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I'm going to keep harping on this probably till the day I die, or until every single American tells me they understand it. So it'll probably be the day I die. Of the fact that within the military, whether it was with the anthrax issue, whether for my generation it was COVID, whether for generations before it was the other ways the military was poisoning its members through experimental testing, which goes, there's a paper trail well back many decades before our time on that topic. That is not in question. Of trying to get people to understand that we say we're a force that is focused on integrity and duty, and yet you can draw a trend line through all generations, and there's always that group there that is willing to say, hey, if people actually hold up to the law and hold up to what's right and will hold up to what's constitutional, they're the ones that are going to pay the price. But I also notice it's those people who are willing to pay the price.
Yeah, it's a sad statement. I did on my website, unyielding.org, one of my talks at the Naval Postgraduate School, where I was grateful to get my master's degree. I did a whistleblower talk there, and I talk about this anomaly where whistleblowers, even though they're supposed to be protected under law, end up paying the consequences. And so I totally agree with you. This is stuff that we've known has been wrong and a malfunction, and hopefully the task force and the after action review folks look at this as well and try to reflect on the malfunctions with the Inspector General process and the command level process, where not only are whistleblowers not helped at all, but they're actually harmed, where the law says they're supposed to be protected. And I am going to throw out a fifth historical anecdote and talk about Senate Report 10397. It was the Senate Veteran Affairs Committee report. Senator Shelby, other senators, Senator Rockefeller, honorable senators from both parties back in the post First Gulf War timeframe were analyzing how veterans had been treated, and they made very, very critical comments about the Department of Defense and their behavior, and not understanding how, when the Veterans Affairs Committee is just trying to help these troops, these whistleblowers, the Department of Defense seems hell-bent on punishing them, gaslighting them, crushing them, abandoning them, not providing them care. And so, fortunately, there's been, with the PACT Act, the promise to address comprehensive toxins, there have been some advancements on how veterans have been treated. And so that's wonderful. But hopefully the after action process will specifically drill down to whistleblower treatment and look at this inversion of accountability and reflect back on how literally, in the mid 1990s, the United States Congress is identifying these historic patterns of malfeasance by the Department of Defense, specifically with exposing soldiers to dangerous toxins, dangerous medicines, and criticizing the Department of Defense for their conduct and their treatment of their veterans. In my opinion, that should be day one primer for the task force to look at that and understand that this has all happened before. Our government has said enough. They've documented the bad behavior. They've put laws in place, 10 U.S.C. 1107, to protect our soldiers from experimentation. They put a law in place, 10 U.S.C. 1107A, for emergency use authorization, unapproved medical products, to protect your generation. And the Department of Defense continues to violate all of the laws, not learn any lessons. And so this task force's responsibility, job is immense, because it needs to actually put in place the curves, put in place the accountability, and make sure the bad behaviors stop once and for all.
And what I try to keep appealing to Secretary Tata and his staff is, what a chance you have to make history. What a chance you have to depart from everything your predecessors have done in terms of passing the buck. And you have the chance to be the guy who actually makes it right. How historic would that be? What an amazing accomplishment would that be? If you don't do the right thing for any other reason, do it for that reason. I mean, you should do it because it's just the right thing to do. But there are selfish reasons as well as selfless reasons for these senior officials to do the right thing. They have no excuse either way on that. And I'm kind of curious, as we wind down here, it's been over 30 years now, and by gum, you're so tenacious, and I love that. And everyone who was over you at that point in time has since retired. Have you, in any of these decades and years since, have you heard from any of them have reached out to you privately and said, hey, yeah, you were right on that?
Multiple examples, many actually documented in my memoir, Unyielding: Marathons Against Illegal Mandates. And, I mentioned earlier how I had commanders that protected me. And so, while there is this bad behavior in the Department of Defense, I would say the vast majority of the chain of command is actually protective of our troops. Certainly once these policies start dying and withering, I think that we need to applaud those commanders, recognize those commanders, stop this inversion of accountability, and actually highlight how they have potentially protected their troops, because there were troops that were protected from the COVID shots. There were troops that were protected from the Anthrax shots. Make some good examples out of those heroes. I was very grateful to, despite all of what happened to me, I went to the Naval Postgraduate, got my graduate school, got my master's, did my thesis on anthrax vaccine, warning the government about the dangers of the anthrax vaccine and cautioning them about procuring any more of it, wasting any more of our taxpayers' money for this drug product in the Strategic National Stockpile. They gave me the thesis award in the program out of a group of 32 military and government officials. So there are examples of good behavior. There are examples of intellectually honest people out there, organizations that do try to do the right thing. Another example was the White House advisors had reached out to me, not only with Karl Rove in the 2001 timeframe, but in the 2018 timeframe with President Trump's administration. They took my thesis. My thesis had recommendations and conclusions on how to handle these kinds kinds of issues in the future, reflecting on the national security decision memorandums of President Nixon, recommending that they establish a biodefense czar, figure out a doctrinally coherent way of dealing with these kinds of threats in the future. And what the president did was they ended up taking those thesis, conclusions, and recommendations and mirroring them in the later 2018 National Biodefense Strategy, first National Biodefense Strategy ever. And what's important about this, and again, for the task force accountability after action reports, is we had a mechanism, we had a presidential strategy in place in 2018, the National Biodefense Strategy. But it was a direct result of the anthrax vaccine experience. And they were supposed to formulate a biodefense steering committee, much as I had recommended the biodefense czar. And they put forth the national security directives as I recommended. And they said that in the future, bioincidents have to be handled in this more cogent manner. And you have to bring all the stakeholders together in order to make sure that we make good decisions for countermeasures in response to these bioincidents. Well, guess what happened? The government at various levels covered up the fact that the COVID release was a bioincident. They tried to make it out as though it was a natural occurrence, not a lab leak. Today, the government is unified. All agencies are unified that it was a lab leak and that we need to learn lessons from that. The task force needs to take that experience, the idea that they've only been formed as a body as a result of a lab leak that the government tried to say was a natural occurrence, not a bioincident, and therefore the National Biodefense Strategy was never implemented. Had the National Biodefense Strategy been implemented and all the stakeholders been brought to the table and the process had not been siloed and stovepiped in the White House, we probably never would have had mandates for unapproved medical products or emergency use authorizations for COVID. So you have to go back to these historical pieces and understand that they failed to implement the National Biodefense Strategy. They did it because people within the government were either lying or covering up the fact that it was a lab leak with some level of U.S. involvement. And so had that not happened, everything would have been different. It's a pivotal aspect of the after action report.
It really is kind of a dominoes falling. When you depart from what's right, at one point, you'll depart from what's right easier the next point, and so on and so on and so forth. Tom, this is awesome. We're out of time here. Where can people connect with you, learn more, and get involved in the fight to make things right for our Anthrax era veterans?
My contact information is at unyielding.org. The book is also there. All profits of the book go to the widow of my dear colleague, Russ Dingle, who was the champion, the intellectual leader in the fight for anthrax vaccine mandate injustices to fix those. And so it's all there. Very grateful to Children's Health Defense, to RFK Jr. For his organization sponsoring the book, being the imprint for the book, and for Skyhorse Publishing for publishing the book. So again, examples that there's a lot of good folks out there. There's a great movement at foot today, and the whole reason this movement is happening for medical freedom and for correcting records is because people are being heard. So while it is very discouraging at times, and I've been doing this for almost 3 decades, it's discouraging at times. Great progress has been made, and if we finally learn the lessons and do the after action report and do the debrief on these abort level no-go type situations with illegal medical mandates for unapproved medical products, we will have won. And fortunately, your generation is getting the particular benefit of that because the President of the United States and the Secretary of War are your champions.
Well, Tom, thanks so much for coming on. Thanks so much for serving. Guys like of my generation stood on your shoulders, and just as you stood on the shoulders of those who came before. And those who come after will likewise stand on ours. I'm privileged to know you. I appreciate your fight, and I'm looking forward to great things happening in these next couple of years to try to make things right for both our generations of vets.
Thanks, Chase. And as the renowned veteran philanthropist H. Ross Perot personally told me, using Churchill's words, never give in, never give in, never give in. He arranged most of those meetings in Washington, D.C. For us, and I think he'd be proud of us, and particularly proud of your generation for learning from ours.
Amen, sir. Amen. Never give in. I think that's the perfect place to end it. Tom Rempfer has been fighting for over 30 years. He has not given in. You should neither. I'm Chase Spears. Thanks for listening.
Remember to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we'll see you next time on Finding Your Spine.